It's Ladies Talking Love, Season 3, Episode 7, Pleasure, courtesy of Female Anatomy. It's Ladies Talking Love, a community of women uncovering more joy and fulfillment in sex, as we learn from experts and amazing women like you. Together, let's create a world where women's sexuality is celebrated and understood, beginning with our own. I'm your host, Ariel Finlinson. Let's talk love. This is an Encore episode from Season 1. It's actually our most listened to episode, and for good reason, because we all need to understand more about female anatomy and female pleasure, and I'm so grateful I can bring this episode back to you. This is crunch time for me. I'm over 37 weeks pregnant, and in the last couple of weeks of my master's degree, and as my final project for my master's degree, I've been piloting a married women's sexuality course. And this is my last week running the course. And so instead of not bringing you an episode, I decided to run an encore so that I could keep the podcast running for a little bit longer before maternity leave. But I am definitely in crunch time. Who knows when this baby will come. So fair warning, this will probably be our last episode for a little while, but I hope to be back soon. And I'm really excited. Now that I'm so close to being done with school, I'm going to get to spend that time creating and bringing you resources and a better website. And I'm planning to make my married women's sexuality course that I'm just piloting an online course and also an in-person course. And so if you're in an area where you'd like to get a group of ladies together, I would love to come and run that course with you guys. So be thinking about that in the next couple weeks or so, because I am going to actually have time to get to do more of what I've been wanting to do this whole time now that school is done. So thank you so much for sticking with me on this journey of the past couple years of school and babies and kids and summer breaks, because as a lot of you may know, being a parent can be kind of sporadic at times. And so I am really grateful for your understanding and sticking around, even though sometimes we need little breaks here and there. But I'm so excited to hit the ground running and work on getting more resources ready for you in the near future. But in the meantime, hop on Instagram and follow me at ladies.talkinglove to stay in the know and see when those new resources are coming up and when the podcast is back up and running after maternity leave. And of course, if you want to see pictures of a sweet new little baby. But without further ado, let's get this Encore episode rolling and talk love. I think one of the hardest transitions into sexual activity was knowing what was normal, knowing what people did to discover how to feel pleasure, especially as a woman, and what people did who had religious values and belief systems that they wanted to stay in line with. In this episode, we're going to talk about a lot of different options and a lot of things that you can do to explore your body and really come to know how you feel pleasure. And after you listen, I hope that you'll take some time to figure out your beliefs and your values and then choose what's going to work best for you and your spouse. I'm joined in this episode by Carlie Palmer-Webb, who is a sex educator and a gender and sexuality researcher. She earned her master's degree in marriage, family, and human development from Brigham Young University. Carlie was born and raised in Weiser, Idaho, and now lives in Vermont with her husband, Dallin, and their cat, Maple. She is abnormally tall and is a lover of mint-flavored chocolate, rock climbing, and cheese. I'm so excited to welcome Carlie Palmer-Webb on to Ladies Talking Love today. Thanks so much for being here, Carlie.
Thanks for having me. Glad to be here.
Can you just give us a little background about what kind of got you interested in the first place in sexuality research, and then when you went on to get your degree in that?
Yeah, for sure. So I never really know exactly where to tell people that this started, but I think I can pinpoint a few moments while I was doing my undergrad where I was like, I really want to do this long term. I didn't think I was going to do it for a career because I didn't know that being a sex educator was a career.
An option.
So, right. But I think it started when I went to college and started dating more seriously. I found myself just having a lot of questions about my body and like what things I was allowed to do as a Christian who was dating and trying to wait until I got married to have sex. So I had a lot of unanswered questions and had no idea who to ask or where to go for the answers. And I grew up in a home where we didn't talk about sexuality or our bodies very openly. So I didn't really feel comfortable going to my parents or siblings. So I just started trying to find resources, and there weren't a ton for people with my experience and with my values for what I wanted sex to be.
It's hard to sift through the information and figure out, especially before you get married, like, oh, what is okay to read? It's just so tricky.
Totally. And so I took a couple of classes, a healthy sexuality class and a marriage preparation class, which it's only called that at a religious university, but and started to learn some basics and just felt like, wow, this is something that I want to know more about. And there have to be other people who are looking for this information and don't know where to find it. So I decided when I went to grad school that I would study developmental psychology and that I would focus on gender and sexuality research. And I was still not married until I graduated from grad school. And so people in my circle sometimes felt a little weird about it because I was choosing to be abstinent and I was a sex researcher, and it was confusing to a lot of people. Some of the people that I dated while I was in my program felt really weird about it. But it just kind of landed me here, and I love it. And I want to be the resource that I was searching for when I was younger.
Well, that was a perfect introduction. We're so happy to have you on to kind of talk about some of those things, because I think even once you start having a partner or get married, it can be really tricky to figure it out. And I think sometimes even to start reading a book or finding information, it's just like, wait, but if I'm reading about this, this is admitting that I don't know and I should know.
Right.
It seems like it should be something that we know. So I would love you to kind of give us a little bit of background. What are some things that we should all know and should have all known before we entered into a relationship, but probably some of us still might not, that every man and woman really should know about each other's anatomy going into a marriage, into a partnership?
Great question. Great question. I love this. So first of all, let me just say, you touched on the fact that a lot of us don't know things that we feel like we should. If you're just learning about this stuff, or if you're learning new things, that's totally okay. We expect ourselves to know these things, except most of us were taught very little about our bodies and sexuality, but we feel like we should know it anyway. So we really shouldn't know it based on our background for a lot of us.
Yes.
So if you're just learning it, that's okay. But I'll start with this. First, I think everybody should understand male and female anatomy. And I think that that's true regardless of the type of relationship that you're pursuing or what your gender identity or sexual orientation is. It's really empowering to understand the human body, to understand how it functions, specifically in this case, to understand sexual functioning. So it's important first to understand the differences and similarities between male and female genitalia and sexual functioning.
Let's do it. Tell us, Carlie.
There are actually a lot more similarities than I think a lot of people realize. And we won't go into all of the reasoning for that, but when an embryo is developing, the tissues all start the same, and then sex differentiation happens at some point. So basically, all of our bodies are made up of the same things. If you read Emily Nagoski's Come As You Are, which is my very favorite book about female sexual functioning, she says, same parts organized in different ways. She says that over and over and over. So the male and female body, the most sensitive sexual organ on the male body is the penis, of course, which most of us understand that pretty early on in our lives. But The most sensitive sexual organ on the female body is the clitoris, which isn't as openly discussed or understood as the penis. So that is where I would start.
When I first read that from Emily Nagoski about same parts organized differently, it was just this moment of like, what? Because our world, everything focuses so much on male sexuality. And then to realize like, wait, we have the same parts. And then realizing even more that actually the clitoris has like twice as many nerve endings as the penis. And it's like, wait a minute,
Yes.
we need to talk about female sexuality because we have so much potential. And just to realize like, oh, if we think males have so much sexual potential, but we're the same parts organized differently, I do too. And I think that was really empowering for me to realize.
Yes, I love that. I love the idea of us having at least equal potential for sexual pleasure and sexual enjoyment, sexual desire, because it absolutely is true. The clitoris does have twice as many nerve endings as the head of the penis, which means it's a lot more sensitive. And women are also capable of multiple orgasms in a row, which to women who are still trying to figure out how to have their first orgasm, that might sound really discouraging. Like, don't tell me I can have multiple. I can't even figure out how to have one. We'll talk about that. But women do have a great potential for sexual pleasure. But that isn't talked about. It isn't taught. In fact, oftentimes in health classes and stuff when we're growing up, we learn about male external genitalia and female internal reproductive organs because we're learning about pregnancy.
Yeah.
We're not learning as much about pleasure. And so we kind of just skip over the female external genitalia, but it's clearly very important if you want to have a fulfilling sex life.
So important. And we're not going to skip over it here because so important. So we know a little bit about the head of the penis and the clitoris are the most sensitive sexual organs. So before we dive into their functioning just a little bit more, can you give us a quick overview of especially female anatomy? Because we didn't get taught that as much.
Yes, definitely. We can focus on the female anatomy for now. So first, a lot of women and men, but specifically I'm talking to the women now because I want you to understand your own bodies. We don't call our body parts the correct names sometimes. So let me just clarify for those of you who are a little unsure about the words, and that's okay if you are, that the external female genitalia is called the vulva. So everything that you can see between your legs, including the clitoris, the labia, the outer and inner labia, and the opening of the vagina is called the vulva, that whole area. And then the vagina is just the canal that goes from the outside of your body to your uterus. When you're teaching your daughters about their bodies, you can teach them that they have a vulva and a vagina. If you want to be more specific about their labia and their clitoris and stuff as they get older, that's great. But it's important to understand those basic parts.
And what about male organs? What are some basic parts that we should understand about?
Well, the male organs are a little bit easier because they're easier to label because they're outside of the body. They're more obvious than female genitalia. But of course, we have the penis that sits in the front. It actually sits at about the same place as the clitoris on the female body, but the clitoris is so much smaller that it doesn't look like it's quite in the same place. And then behind the penis are the testicles. And the scrotum is the skin, just the sacs, essentially, that hold the testicles. Most men have 2 testicles, but that's not always the case. And then if you work your way back from the front of the body towards the back of the body, internally, there are some other things. Men have a prostate, which isn't something women have, that develops some of the fluid that makes up semen. I mean, we could go in more detail, but I think that's plenty for now.
I think that's a good overview. And just thinking about, I love that analogy of Emily Nagoski's as well, because I was one of those that I don't know if I'd maybe heard the word once before I got married, but I didn't know what a clitoris was. I didn't know I had one. And it was like, wait a minute.
why has no one told me this? And I have chosen personally to be very open with my children. And so my kids, as part of bath time, we talk about the clitoris and all the parts, but I want my daughters to know this part of their body, because I think it can create shame when we don't talk about it. But I love too that the clitoris, what we see, is so
Yes.
much smaller than what it actually is. And it is the internal organ that has so much potential. So how, now that we kind of know these different parts, male and female, and most of us probably know the really horrible definition of sex that I really dislike, that it's penetration. It's not.
You and me are on the same page with this.
But that's kind of how we've been taught. So we know, like, okay, penetration, sex, but where does the clitoris come in? How do we as women going into these relationships understand and get to know our clitoris, know what it can do? How do we even begin?
That's such a great question. And it might look a little different for everybody, but I'll share a few thoughts. When you ask where does the clitoris come in, this is kind of a question that a lot of women ask me in different ways. Like, what is supposed to happen with the clitoris when sex is to them penis in vagina intercourse? So, using a word that's often used when we talk about these things, foreplay, which is what people call like the making out and touching each other leading up to sex in the, kind of older
Intercourse.
understanding, leading up to intercourse. Foreplay is what it's called when you're touching each other's bodies and kissing and doing whatever you want to do to, as it's been understood, lead up to intercourse. But what is often labeled foreplay is where the stimulation of the clitoris often happens with your partner's hand or your own hand while you're doing different things with a vibrator, if that's something that you've chosen, with your partner's mouth or penis or whatever. That often happens during foreplay, so it's treated as if it's leading up to the main event.
It's not part of sex, in quotes.
Right. But in my mind, stimulation of the female's most sensitive sexual organ and stimulation of the male's most sensitive sexual organ, that is sex. And for each,
amen,
stimulation of the penis and stimulation of the clitoris, like that is the main event for penis owners and for clitoris owners. So I don't call it foreplay anymore because for me, that's the whole show. That is the parade. Yes.
So, and I've loved recently, I saw some just posts that I loved talking about that, like, sex is about pleasure. And so whatever is pleasurable is sex. Yes. And I think that was a huge shift for me in my journey, is just being able to take this word that has been giving this horrible definition, yes, and broaden it, because sex in our old school definition doesn't include women. Right. And that's important because you're just as capable, if not more. I might even say very much more capable, because we can have multiple orgasms, yes, in one encounter. Yes. And so you have potential, which I think is huge to understand.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And the more we understand our own capacity for sexual pleasure and how to experience sexual pleasure, the more we're able to communicate that with our partner, and the better they're able to understand our experience. And that's when the magic really happens.
Okay, so there's probably some people listening like, okay, wait, what? How do you kind of start these conversations with your spouse or partner to say, I could use some more stimulation. I really would like to enjoy sex more, but that can be really tricky, because I think a lot of us sometimes fall into this, oh, this is sex, I guess this is what it is. And maybe we've been married for 10 years, 5 years, maybe we just got married, maybe we're not married yet, but how do you bring that in and kind of shift what may have become normal to a better place?
Well, I think a powerful way to do it is relate it to the experience that your partner might already be having, especially in heterosexual couples. So if you are a female who is in a relationship with a man, then they're likely experiencing a lot of pleasure when you have sex. And men orgasm 96-97% of the time that they have sex. For women, it's a lot less frequent than that. So their experience with sex is likely, based on averages, quite good and quite pleasurable. So if your experience with sex isn't as pleasurable and you're not experiencing orgasm very frequently, then you can say to them, I just learned that my body is capable of loving sex as much as you do, if not more. You don't have to throw that if not more out, because I guess
we'll just keep that in our little ladies chat, okay?
But I just learned this about my body. But for me, pleasure is going to be brought on by different things. We're all socialized through media and some of our education in school, though it was likely limited for many of us, to assume that pleasure happens during intercourse for men and women. But that's simply not the case. The vagina isn't very sensitive. There aren't a lot of nerve endings in the vagina. So intercourse isn't going to be really pleasurable for most women. And most women won't orgasm from intercourse. Some will. And if you can, that's awesome. So happy for you. But most won't. So I would just encourage you to communicate with your partner that what he is experiencing during intercourse, that type of pleasure is possible for you, but it's not going to happen during intercourse. It's going to happen from the consistent stimulation of the clitoris, not from penetration in the vagina.
So then how do we kind of, as women, now that we've thought about that maybe a little bit, how do we find what feels good? Because it's different for everyone. And that's a huge part with your spouse, to be able to decide how that works. Because I know some women, it's like, they just think they can just touch my clitoris and I'll be having an orgasm, but that's not the case. We all have, different things that we like. And especially for some of us coming from more religious backgrounds, what are some of the blocks that keep us from being able to understand how our clitoris and our sexual organs work? And then how can we kind of overcome those and learn to feel pleasure?
Yeah, definitely. Well, let me first address one quick thing about anatomy, and then we'll talk about some of the mental blocks. So one of the struggles that a lot of women have as they try to learn about their clitoris and try to communicate to their partner that they want their partner to stimulate their clitoris more is that because the clitoris is so sensitive, it can be overstimulated or can be touched too soon. So if a woman isn't sufficiently aroused, if she's not excited about sex, her body isn't aroused, then stimulation of the clitoris might be painful. Or it just might not feel very good. It could be uncomfortable. So there does still need to be some buildup of physical touch, not of the genitals, before you move into clitoral stimulation.
I'm so glad you brought that up. And also, while we're on this topic really quick, some women get too sensitive for penetration after they have an orgasm. What are just some quick suggestions before we move on to this other section, but just to kind of handle that with your partner? If you realize once you start being able to feel pleasure that, I actually can't have intercourse.
Yes. So this is where it's really different for different women. So I can't say do this and it will be okay, or do this and it will change your experience, because every woman's body is really different and will respond to pleasure and stimulation in different ways. But I will say this requires a lot of communication, and it requires that you figure out with your partner. I don't mean to make light of this, but basically who's going to go first, whose pleasure are we going to focus on first? Whose orgasm are we going to pursue first? Because simultaneous orgasm is quite rare. So some
wait, say that one more time.
Simultaneous orgasm is rare. It's actually very
Which
rare.
I think is so important, because that's like what we are socialized to believe. Yeah. Like, if you even believe in women liking sex, it's like, oh, it just happens at the same time.
Right. And if you've ever seen a sex scene in a movie or anything like that, it's portrayed as simultaneous orgasm always. And that's just not a reality. So some couples find it easiest if they pursue her orgasm first and then pursue his. Some prefer to pursue his orgasm first and then hers, like in the case that you mentioned, Ariel, that some women have a difficult time with penetration after orgasm. Because women can orgasm multiple times, you can sandwich it. So it really just depends on the couple and what seems to work for you. And it requires time and communication and trying out different things in order to discover what you like the best as a couple. But that exploration can also be fun. Learning that you can experience sexual pleasure and figuring out how to do it. I mean, that's got to be the best exploration there could possibly be. So don't get too frustrated when it takes some time.
And I think it can be really frustrating. I know for me, it was a really hard, frustrating journey. But I think it's so beautiful to have you kind of give us some of these examples because we are all different. And for me in my journey, I wish I had been more understanding that I think probably every male partner wants their spouse, their wife, to feel pleasure during sex. And sex is better for him if you are involved and you're enjoying yourself. And so if you can really communicate and figure this out together, it can be really hard to open up that conversation and maybe feel embarrassing or maybe there's shame. And we're going to talk about some of those blocks next, but that we can figure this out together and it becomes something beautiful, and our spouses will feel so much more connection and more pleasure. And you will as well when you can enjoy it together and have those open conversations.
Yes.
But there are some really hard blocks for women. What are some of the blocks that make it hard for us to learn how to experience pleasure?
Well, I think one of the blocks, particularly for highly religious women, is the teachings that a lot of us internalized about masturbation growing up. And this is kind of a difficult topic to discuss because the sexual research world and the religious world, specifically conservative Christian teachings, are really polarized on the topic of masturbation. But because we've been taught, a lot of us growing up, that you should never self-stimulate or you should never touch your genitals, we feel totally uncomfortable even trying to find our clitoris with our hands, like we don't know what's okay. And that can breed a lot of guilt and shame. And I will say, I think every woman and every couple needs to figure out what is okay for them and what behaviors align with their personal values. But I will say to those who still are very engaged in some of these conservative Christian religions, I am, so I understand the pull. I understand how difficult it can be to manage these things. But for me, what I've found that helps me navigate this particular issue is that I believe God intended sex to be pleasurable. I believe that he intended sex to be a relational experience. So for me, masturbating when I was single wasn't something that I chose. But as a married woman who wants to have a pleasurable sexual experience with my husband and who wants our sexual relationship to be really a good and happy and enjoyable part of our marriage, I have had to do some self-exploration, trying to figure out with my husband what feels good to me. And touching myself has been part of that. That's weird to say on a podcast.
I'm so glad you did, though. I'm so glad you did.
And my husband, for us, we've decided that we want that to be a relational experience. So my husband is there. He is involved. He's a part of the exploration because he wants to learn with me what feels good. But it's a lot harder to explain to someone what feels good to you when you actually have no idea.
Yes. And we don't know. We don't even know where
Mm-hmm.
to start. And I'm so glad you brought that up, because I think for some people, you might feel comfortable to do some self-exploration without your spouse there. And if you decide that and it aligns with your values, that's
Yes,
awesome.
I
And
agree.
for some, you might not. And for me personally, I was kind of in the same realm. I did some self-exploration, but I have a lot of religious values and things that were a little conflicting. And so I did enjoy being able to explore with my husband. And I've mentioned it before, but for me, there was a great book that I loved called Slow Sex.
Mhm.
And it gives you these little practices that are encapsulated into like 15 minutes. So it's not a sexual experience as in like we're having sex. It's literally about learning the woman's body. And I loved that it kept it that way because it took away some of the pressure that some of us may feel to like perform
Mhm.
or to, I think probably a lot of us have faked an orgasm before,
Yes.
just to like pretend. It takes that pressure away that this is a time my husband and I are setting aside to learn about my
Yeah.
body. And that was really empowering for me. And I'd love to hear some of your other tips on ways we've talked about like self-exploration. And I
Mhm.
don't know if we can get a little more in depth, but
Yeah.
like, what does that look like? Like, how can women start to find what feels
Yeah.
good in these situations?
Yeah. Well, the first thing I would say is make sure you know exactly where your clitoris is. So if you need to look at a diagram, you can Google a diagram or look at my Instagram, but identify where your clitoris is on a diagram and then find it on yourself. I mean, next time you're in the shower, when you're washing your vulva, try to identify the head of the clitoris, which you talked, Ariel, a little bit about the whole structure of the clitoris. Most of it is internal and it kind of wraps down around our vagina. But the head of the clitoris is the most sensitive part of your vulva. So when you find it, you'll know because it is the most
And it's
sensitive.
underneath like a little
Yeah.
hood. So you can almost kind of
Yeah.
lift up
So you kind of have to,
the front of your
yeah,
vulva.
yeah. If you lift and spread apart your outer labia while lifting up kind of towards your belly button, then you'll be able to feel the head of the clitoris. So identify it first. And then with your partner or by yourself, just feel around and see what types of touch feel pleasurable. Oftentimes, friction, because it's so sensitive, friction can be rather uncomfortable. So the shower is a good place because the water decreases friction. But if you're not in the shower, then using some kind of lubricant can be really helpful, both while you're first figuring it out and during sex with your partner later on. It can reduce some of the friction. And if it's uncomfortable because it's so sensitive, that can make it more comfortable for it to be touched. And that's where I would start. If you are a woman who has been in a marriage or in a sexual relationship for a lot of years and you know where your clitoris is and you know what makes it feel good, but you're still unable to orgasm, then there might be some different things to try. Some women feel like this kind of is a cop out to say this, but a lot of women have a really, really difficult time orgasming without extra help, specifically a vibrator.
A vibrator, yes.
Some women just need it to orgasm, and that is totally okay. A vibrator can give a type of stimulation that the human body just isn't capable of. So if you have been in a relationship for a really long time and haven't been able to learn how to orgasm and you're comfortable with a vibrator, then I would recommend that you try one and see if that helps you get to the point where you can orgasm. Almost all women, as far as we know, are capable of orgasm. So if you haven't gotten there, it's not because you're broken or there's something wrong with you. It's just that you haven't learned what works for you yet.
And most women have to learn how to orgasm, which I just think is so fascinating. For men, I think, it's external. Their parts are there.
Right.
Their penis is external. It's easier. But for women, most people do have to learn. And I loved this analogy that Kristen Hodson talked about. She was talking about using vibrators and using these other things. And that can be hard sometimes to bring into a relationship, because it's not saying that our spouse isn't capable or we're not capable. It's just allowing something else to try. And I loved, she did this analogy that if you were to have cookies that someone brought you, would you care if they were hand mixed or from an electric mixer? And she's
I
like,
love
there's
that.
no difference. And I just loved that analogy because it can be hard for some of us, especially in religious culture, to get our brain wrapped around it. But I also love she kind of was debunking these theories that like, it doesn't replace your spouse. Like this isn't a replacement. This is something to enhance your pleasure. And if you and your partner are okay with that, that's awesome. If you're not, that's okay too. But there's options for you to try. And with orgasming, I think there's a lot of mental blocks that can come for women. And I want to do a whole other episode with Carlie on this, but I just want to briefly cover some tips here for women who have tried and they've been trying to feel pleasure and they can't. And I've been there, and it is so frustrating to be really trying and you just can't. You can't feel it and you just can't be present. What are some tips you would give to those women?
So for women who are trying to learn to orgasm and are having a really difficult time, here's one tip that might be helpful. That is to focus on the pleasure that you're currently experiencing instead of the orgasm that you're trying to reach. So when I was dating, and I was 28 when I got married, which is average in the United States, but old in Christian culture. So as I was dating for a long time, people would always tell me, if you stop caring, if you stop thinking about it, then you'll find the person that you want, that you're going to marry. And I hated when people would tell me that. It bugged me so badly because I'm like, nobody stops caring ever. Like it isn't a thing. So stop telling me to do that. And I recognize that when you're having a difficult time orgasming, that people telling you to stop thinking about it can feel similar to that advice. I have gone through phases where it's really difficult for me to reach orgasm. And even when I would read that specific advice in really well-known sex ed books, I would still be kind of frustrated. Like, how am I supposed to just stop thinking about an orgasm when I'm trying so hard to reach orgasm? So something that helped me, instead of just trying not to think about it, which is really hard, was I would just focus on the pleasure of different parts of my body, focus on the sensations that different parts of my body were experiencing. Sometimes that's the clitoris, but also like, can you feel your partner's warmth on your body and what's happening on your face? And are you kissing and how does that feel? And is your partner touching you here? And what does that feel like? Focusing on the pleasure of specific areas has really been helpful for me because it gives my mind something to do. When we just try to not think about orgasm, we're like, okay, what am I supposed to think about? Like, I can't think about nothing. That's not a thing for me. So that's what I would say is try to focus on the pleasure, focus on different parts of your body. Some people refer to this as sexual mindfulness, which can be really powerful, finding ways to be embodied, to experience what's happening from within your body instead of from an observer's perspective, which can be hard for women if they're feeling uncomfortable with their body. They might be thinking about, what does my partner see from this point of view? What do I look like to my partner? Those kinds of things can distract you from the orgasm. So keep trying to pull your mind back to what parts of my body are feeling a sensation right now that feels good, and then focus on that.
And I really like that idea. I know mindfulness, I'm not a super dedicated meditator, but when I do and I think about it, it really helps. And one thing, even just in intimate moments that's helpful is for me or my husband to say things out loud that we're feeling, like you talked about, like the weight or the warmth. And that really helps focus my mind and bring it back. And also, just to recap, something Carlie said that I think is so important is, medically speaking, it is so rare for women not to be capable of orgasm. Pretty much 100% of women are capable. But if you are finding it to be really hard, maybe look at your relationship as well, because there are things that can happen in a relationship that it might be a block because you're not feeling as connected. And that is one of my biggest things. If we are emotionally, mentally, spiritually, all these other things connected, our connection in the bedroom is going to be so much more powerful. And so if you find that you do need therapy or you need help to uncover some of those things, this is not to replace that. But I think that for normal, healthy marriages, these are really great places to start to really understand your pleasure and what you are capable of. And
Definitely.
just to quick close up, I would just love Carlie to give us several tips for women who have never had an orgasm or even don't like sex. They haven't experienced it to be pleasurable. What are some things they can do to start?
So the first thing that I would say is get yourself to the point where you believe that pleasurable, good sex is possible for you. For some of us, that might take a lot of time and internal work, because if you've been in a sexual relationship for a long time and have not liked it for a long time, it can be difficult to convince yourself or to believe that something else is possible. But that's where I would start. And I think one of the best ways to get to that point is to really focus on educating yourself. There are so many books and other resources available to women, and some targeted directly towards Christian women, that can help you understand your body, your sexual functioning, what your body is capable of, what might be considered normal sexual functioning, which a lot of women think that their sexual functioning is abnormal, but it rarely is. If you're experiencing pain, that's something that you should seek help from a medical professional for. Other than that, what you're experiencing is likely normal.
Yes.
So believe that pleasurable sex is possible for you. And to do that, work to educate yourself. Come As You Are is always the first book on sexual functioning that I recommend to women. It is incredible. It's incredible.
Phenomenal.
So please read Come As You Are.
Yes.
If you have a lot of shame and guilt attached to your sexuality or your sexual relationship, I just finished a newer book called The Great Sex Rescue, which is targeted towards Christian women who grew up in purity culture, and it is beautiful. I love this book, and I have read so many books about sex and so many books directed towards Christians about sex, and this is one of my very favorites. So it's been really helpful for me to work through some things that I've been hanging on to from purity culture that I didn't even know I still believed after several years of being very involved in this research. So yes, educate yourself, please.
That is such good advice. And I love how you brought up that you are normal. Even if you are at a stage where you don't like sex, that is normal. And a lot of it comes from that tip to know that sex is good and fulfilling, that a lot of those feelings are what is making it not enjoyable. Mm-hmm. So even if that's what you're feeling, you're normal. Yes. And we're here for you. Yes. Thank you so much, Carlie. This has been awesome. And I will make sure and link those books in the show notes. And then as well, we are going to have Carlie back on, and we'll be covering some more topics about desire and about how to kind of overcome some of these harmful cultural beliefs. So thanks so much for joining me today, Carlie.
Yes, thanks for having me.
Man, I wish that I had had this podcast episode a long time ago. I loved how Carlie just talked so openly about so many things that I remember having questions about. How do I figure out how to explore myself? Is it okay for me to touch myself to feel what feels good? Do I do that by myself? Do I do it with my partner? Just so many things. And hearing other people talk about it is so helpful to then look at your values and know it's an option, and then be able to decide what actually will work for you. And I'm so grateful for these conversations being opened. I wanted to briefly recap some of her tips at the end, especially as we're beginning this journey. She said the most important thing that we can do is get ourselves to the point that we believe sex is good and that pleasure is possible, that it's possible for you. She said a good way to do that is to focus on educating ourselves. Two of the books that she recommended are Come As You Are by Emily Nagoski and The Great Sex Rescue, which is focused on Christian women who grew up in purity culture and have a lot of barriers and things to overcome. I will link both of those in the show notes. Thank you so much for being here. Thanks for trusting us to help you open up these conversations in your relationship, in your family, and thanks for talking love. Thank you to all of you who listen and join me on this journey, and to our Ladies Talking Love team who make the podcast possible. Thanks to our sound wizard, Brett Hansey, our newsletter guru, Lauren Barton, and our miscellaneous task was Jana Norman. As always, thanks for talking love.